Hi, everyone. Heather here with astrologywithheather.com, and I'm back with another special video and another special guest. Today, I have with me once again my good friend, Chriselda Pacheco. Welcome, Chriselda.
Hello, thank you. I was excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you, and I'm excited for this talk. And for those of you who don't already know Chriselda, Chriselda is a Hermeticist, a Gnostic priestess, and she does a lot of things. We're going to get into some really interesting information today, super relevant to what's going on right now in the astrology as well, because we have a Jupiter Neptune conjunction forming in the skies right now as we speak, super exact, which is a beautiful energy and a hopeful energy. And it does have the possibility to bring a lot of really great opportunities, a lot of really great it's almost like an energy where luck and good fortune can just fall into your lap. However, when we have Neptune involved, when we have Pisces involved, even with the great benefic Jupiter, there are some downfalls. And those downfalls are things like being prone to going off into la la land, being prone to escapism through drugs, alcohol, substances, or escapism through fantasy or spiritual bypassing. And that's what we're here to talk about today with Chriselda, because she is an expert in this topic and she is basically the anti-spiritual bypasser. So she's gonna give us a hard knock on reality here today.
Right. Did you want me to talk a little bit about the spiritual bypass?
Yeah. So
Okay.
First off, how did you get into looking into this topic and doing this work?
Into the topic of spiritual bypass in particular, or like the Hermeticist? Okay. So, well, spiritual bypass is sort of like when for those people who are curious about the term and they've never heard it or not sure what it is, it's sort of like when we decide to escape into some sort of like love and light situation. For instance, that's just kind of an example I'm using because that's everywhere, right? This sort of toxic positivity where you're in denial or want to remain in denial about the dark aspects of life, the negative aspects of life, the very scary but real aspects that need to be looked at too, right? The truth of life. And so people who want to avoid uncomfortable conversations, who want to avoid that kind of thing. And so sometimes they go to spirituality. Today, I mean, it could be Christianity too, to give your problems away, to God, or it can be this new age movement as well. We can see that playing out in a lot of ways. So that's what spiritual bypass is. And the reason it's so important to me is because I feel like I have earned a lot of this knowledge with my own blood, sweat, and tears as a retired sex worker of 20 years. I went into hell, to get this knowledge in a lot of ways. And so for people to just suddenly decide that they have something to offer, but they haven't had their hands dirty too much, they haven't really done the work. I feel like it's very insincere and unfair. You know what I mean? You're not getting it from a source. You're getting it from like fifth or sixth hand, if that makes any sense. And so I think it's important to talk about that too, in terms of where did you get the knowledge? Is it embodied, or is it all just up in here and it remains in here, if that makes any sense? So that's where I'm coming from.
So basically, instead of avoiding situations that are dark, taboo, uncomfortable, you dove straight into those situations and learned a lot from doing that and saw the value in it. Whereas in the spiritual community today, a lot of people do the exact opposite. They run from anything that's uncomfortable or that's taboo or that, feels a little icky to them in the moment. But there's definitely a lot of value in that. Like we don't grow, we don't change without challenge, without discomfort. And yeah, that's super important. And so Chriselda, by the way, is going to be doing a free webinar, 90 minutes on this topic of spiritual bypassing. Super valuable. You can find that link to sign up at the description below. And we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end and what you can expect. But before we get into that, let's dive deep into this topic, because this is a very good one and a very interesting one. And especially as an astrologer, I'll even see people who will comment on my videos when I talk about malefic planets, which is basically just a designation, like a category of planets. I didn't invent that terminology. You get like viciously angry at me. It's almost like talking about something that could potentially be challenging or negative just ignites this fury in certain people who are pretending to be like love, light, and rainbows. They'll be like, stay blessed at the end and like stuff like that. And I'm just like,
Oh,
you are in a race
wow.
right now. And so I was wondering if you could kind of speak to that, like the fact that even speaking about something in a spiritual setting that could be potentially challenging or negative can trigger people so intensively.
Oh God, we talked about this yesterday with Elena and Shanna, the video we did too. And it's this passive aggressive thing, that really exists on the feminine spectrum and the feminine principle. It's this hostility that's under the surface. It's just so hostile. And again, it's just one of those things that I think it's so ingrained in us. It's so in our unconscious from religion, particularly Judeo-Christian, influence, right? A deep influence between good and evil, negative and positive. And there's a moralization of the negativity from this religion, right? So we put this moralized lens on something that is not evil or good. It just is. There's always going to be something hidden. Even when that's revealed, there's a new thing that's hidden. This is the law of nature, right? And so I think we have been conditioned in this culture through the roots of Judeo-Christian values to demonize and avoid and gaslight and cast out or not want to look at the negative, right? The darkness, because deep in our unconscious, it's like not good enough or it's evil. You know what I mean? There's a moralization of this natural law. And this thing runs real deep. And I think that people who have that kind of reaction immediately really have to do this deep shadow work, because the sooner you face it, you're going to realize, oh, it wasn't as scary as I thought.
Yeah. And that's the thing I was going to ask. Like, do you think it's rooted in fear? Because on my end, I feel like it's a lot of fear. Like, oh my gosh, if this planet has the ability to induce challenge or is correspondent with challenge, what does that mean for me? Like, how dare you do this to me? Like that type of thing, like where they're afraid that something will happen to them. And unfortunately, part of this reality, this tangible reality we live in is challenge. Like things happen in our lives that are objectively challenging, that are perceived as negative or uncomfortable or a struggle or whatever. Suffering is a part of life. It's not life itself, but it's a part of our life and our experience.
Yeah.
And to deny that and to pretend that it doesn't exist in an astrology reading or in any other setting is to deny the reality of our existence. And so, yeah, it's a very strange thing, but most people, I would say, don't take it to these extremes, but every single one of us in one way or another feels uncomfortable with situations that are scary or challenging or different or dark or whatever. And so how do we identify that within ourselves and work on that so we can face it without so much fear?
Well, looking at the patterns of what triggers you, becoming aware and decide today when we wake up, okay, I'm going to start this journey of shadow work, to use a term that's flying around everywhere, right? I'm going to start this journey of shadow work. And one of the ways I'm going to do it is really bring forward into my awareness here, okay, I'm going to pay attention. This is what my grandpa taught me. He raised me. He always said, you have to pay attention. So I'm going to pay attention to how many times I'm triggered today and exactly what triggered me. And I'm going to do this continuously for however long. It could be 2 weeks, a month, whatever. And by the end of this particular time I've set aside to pay attention to this in a more acute way, I'm going to look back at the patterns. What time of day was it? Was I driving? Was it a song I heard? And start to actually become your own scientist. This is data collecting. So we can look at it that way to help our ego deal with it. Oh, it's data collecting, and just do that. And then examine the patterns and how often every day, and you'll start to see something come up, like the negative to a photograph, right? The old school way that you develop photographs. And it's like, oh, there it is. But you have to do that work. Nobody can do it for you because only you are in your mind. So if you're serious about doing that, I would recommend that's one way to start. That's a very strong way to start. Start looking for patterns. And sometimes throughout the day, sometimes, trauma revisits us for some reason at 1 o'clock in the afternoon every day, or at 3 o'clock in the afternoon for some reason. So just look for patterns. you know.
Yeah. And I mean, your grandfather was super wise because in my clinical psychology training, we were taught to deliver that exercise. And in my trauma informed yoga therapy training, same exercise. And
Oh, wow.
so that's not like uncommon. And that's
Right.
something that even like it's like professional psychological advice, like do something like that. So yeah, that process can be super powerful because there's so many things that our brains are associating with past experiences that we're not consciously aware of.
Right.
And even that triggering us can change the way we perceive something very positive in our environment at that moment.
Right. I mean, there's only empowerment waiting for the people or persons that decide to go ahead and look at it.
Yeah.
You know, when it's haunting you, it has all the power. You know what I mean? When you turn and look at the ghost or ghosts, you know what I mean, plural, you're standing in your power. And that's another way of putting it, is taking back your power. So once you face it, you realize, oh, it's not as bad as I thought, or maybe it is, but now I'm really going to grow bigger than that, you know. But it's, if you keep letting it haunt you and trigger you, you're going to keep suffering and suffering. It's almost masochistic to
Yeah.
not decide to just look at it, you know.
Like avoiding it. Yeah.
Right, right.
That makes sense. So in addition to that, what are some of the other consequences of spiritual bypass, in your opinion?
You're not living your authentic life. You're not living in your authentic self. There's some kind of mimicking of another self out there. You know, it's a sort of relying on people, or comparing and contrasting all the time, comparing yourself to other people, trying to copy other people. It doesn't live, that knowledge doesn't live in your body. You know, we haven't examined our own experiences, and so we're vulnerable. We're vulnerable to be manipulated. We're vulnerable to being triggered all the time, to live in this constant anxiety. And you know what I mean? Like, if this, like, I'm not in my body, I don't believe in myself, so I have to copy, I have to compare. I mean, it's when, you know, you're living a life that is not authentically your life, you know, and that to me, that's something terrible, right? You want to be able to be here and be present and own our experiences and say, oh my God, look at this awesome, very unique alchemical elixir I've created out of my
Mhm.
own experience that isn't anybody else's. Well, what's so cool is if they do it too, then look at all the elixirs that are created. They're unique, and it's all like medicine, your unique
Yeah.
medicine contribution to the world.
Instead of being like carbon copies of each other because we're just learning through book learning instead of experiential
Right,
knowledge because we're not
right,
actually going in and doing the work, which
right.
is such a Sagittarius rising thing to say, by the way.
There you go.
Gaining wisdom through going out there and having direct experiences, adventures, right? Which are the whole spectrum of experience.
Right. I mean, that's the only real way to learn. And some people really are afraid to take these calculated risks. And I understand.
Yeah.
But at some point, that's part of the liberation. You know, you have to, you know.
Okay. And so, in addition to kind of looking at what triggers us, how can we know when we are experiencing like a spiritual bypass? Like, what are the signs that, hey, I'm avoiding this? Because sometimes you're
Right.
not aware, it's just
Oh,
so
right.
automatic.
Right. Well, if you're finding yourself, one of the very obvious ways is to use social media, right? So, like on Instagram, um, if you're finding yourself adopting everybody else's language all the time,
Mhm.
and you haven't come up with your own language, but some people have a hard time with that, and I understand the legitimate like challenge with coming up with language. Sometimes we have to use other people's, but if you remain there and don't attempt to now start to find a way to explain it yourself, you know what I mean, that's more
Yeah.
authentic. That's one kind of way, as an example, as an obvious one, because we're all on Instagram probably and on social media, and so it's kind of like, oh, are you taking people's words? Are you taking people's ideas and pretending they're yours? Right?
Mhm.
That is something to look at. Um, if we are doing that, because we're inspired by the people, but then, like I said a minute ago, we don't start to integrate our own uniqueness in it, and
Mhm.
you know, and we just remain relying on continuing to patchwork and do that sort of thing, then that's one sign that we're avoiding something. You know, we want to take the work from other people who've done the work, you know, and pretend that it's ours. And it's like, why do we not believe ourselves enough? Have we not examined our own life experiences enough to trust that there's enough there to create something unique that's me? That's one way. There's so many other ways that, symbolize spiritual bypass, but I think that's a very obvious one to use, because I think that happens a lot on Instagram and social media.
And that's a really unique perspective, because I've never heard anybody point that out before. But I mean, that's true, because when you have had a direct experience with something, that it's true and you're confident with that experience, even if other people aren't and they don't believe you or whatever, because you've done it. Whereas if you haven't had that experience and you're repeating somebody else's experience or what they've learned through that experience, you're not going to have that same confidence. And you might not have your own way of articulating it because you only have an intellectual understanding.
Right. Yeah. And so that's just one example. Another one is what we talked about just a minute ago. And that was, the not looking at the things that keep triggering you. The two taboos, sex and death. And these are the two things that are powerful litmus tests. How do you feel when we talk about sex or sex related things or themes? When you find yourself confronted with that, the same with death, how do you feel about that? All things are connected to those two that are the most taboo, right? Sex and death. And so what do you think about those two things? What's the first feeling you get in your body when you think of sex or death? Is it shame? Is it fear? Are you terrified? Are you disgusted? Like, what is it? Start asking yourself questions about that, because those are the roots.
Yeah.
Those are the most threatening things,
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And that's like in astrology, the 8th house. And that's the house that people are always afraid of, or like when transits go through there, they're like, oh God, what's going to happen? And it's a really misunderstood house as well.
Right.
And it's like sex, death, and power. And all of these things are interconnected very much so.
Yeah. Right. I have a stellium there, right? This is
stellium. And your sun's there and all that. So you have like a lot of 8th house energy.
Right.
Yeah. So you've lived the 8th house and, you're putting it out there in the world.
I'm saying it's not as scary as you think. It really isn't. We can have fun with it too. It doesn't have to be something that's so terrifying that it's paralyzing. We can turn it into fun. We can go into the caverns and look around. We can have a parade in there, Let's just turn it into fun. Let's take our power back with it. It's very empowering because you become not bigger in ego as some people might, but I mean, the point is you feel more full, you feel more integrated, you feel more like you're landing in your body, you're more present, you're on the ground, you're rooted. And you're not as easily manipulated anymore. You're not, it's hard to fool you the more and more that you face those things.
Yeah. And well, it's because you're not facing all of reality. And so once you're integrating that, because reality isn't only sex and death, but it also isn't only love and rainbows. It's everything. It's everything. And that's the beautiful thing about our existence. And that's the most wonderful thing about astrology, is that it shows all of it. It shows the full spectrum of possibility in the human experience, and it describes it perfectly. And to deny that as an astrologer, you are doing a huge disservice to your clients. 110%. Like if you're an astrologer that won't say something it's potentially challenging or negative, I always give solutions. I don't just say you're doomed. Like that's bad too. Because again, it's everything, right? There's a whole spectrum of stuff going on there. But to just pretend like, oh, everything in your chart is beautiful and you're going to only have blessings and you're the luckiest person in the world to every single client. Yeah, they'll love you and they'll probably come back if that's what they want to hear from you because it makes them feel good. Right. But it's not helping them. Right. It's just not.
Well, Carl Jung, I was saying this for a long time about finding the third point, and I always use the totem of the eagle and say, become the eagle's eye and observe the duality, from that space. And Carl Jung talks about holding the tension of the two opposites. And so being able to do that is liberating, because if you're able to do that, then those two things can't trigger you. You find a way to observe reality from outside the self while you're in the self. And that's powerful. It's very shamanic, it's magic. It really is. And it's liberating. So that's what we're all being asked to do, is to challenge the ego, as well, to get the ego out of the way. That don't kill it, we need it. I hate that too, when people say get rid of your ego. That's crap. That's crap. So you need it,
Yeah.
just don't allow it to dictate your life. Know how to move it around, and use it. Don't let it use you.
That is really well put. I love that.
Yeah, and I've learned the hard way. So
Well, awesome. Yeah. So this has been really fascinating so far. Is there anything else you want to add that you think is important, especially with the times that we're in right now, because we have so much, like, so many extremes going on right now
Right.
in our reality?
Right. Well, like this, to look for the polarities and everything. This is what I do, is understand that we are living in a duality. You can't have something that's more than a duality without the duality. You can't have you can't have gray without black and white.
Mhm.
So we live in the duality of masculine and feminine, and so just to acknowledge that everything's connected. How one acts is going to dictate how the other responds, and so we're living in that cause and effect, right? And so to keep an open mind about that this is also the law of nature, and it's happening in our own personal lives, the cause and effect. It's happening in the macro, right? So this is why it's best to just don't live half-witted. Look at the darkness as well as the light. What is in the darkness that is manifested in the light? Always look for the root of things. What's the root of this? What's the root of that? Go digging. That's my advice.
That is absolutely wonderful advice, especially for where we're
Yeah.
at right now.
Right.
And so you're doing, as I mentioned before, a full 90-minute free webinar that's going to have, I'm sure, all sorts of super valuable information. I highly recommend, if you attend, bring a journal. You're going to want to take lots of notes. You're going to have a lot of thoughts that come up. So what can everybody expect to kind of gain from that experience? Like, what are the observable effects that they're going to get from the information that you're providing?
I think, believe it or not, people think I'm a pessimist, and I can be, but I honestly believe that there are more people truly ready and willing to do this work. I really do. I just think there's so much information out there, and it's just a lot of noise. It's like, where do I start? How can I create some kind of structure and some kind of container? And so what they're going to get out of this webinar, it's called Avoid Spiritual Bypass. And I'm going to talk about different ways that they can actually observe their own lives every day, become aware of their own lives and their experiences that they're having, and how valuable those experiences are, and how they don't have to rely on things outside of themselves, people outside of themselves, to always reflect back to them, how they can do that themselves. So by the end of this webinar, I think that they'll walk away with concrete things to do every day, and then also see how that adds up to just a complete change, where now the way they're walking in the world is with a lot more awareness, and it becomes second nature. You know what I mean? It's a new way of observing and paying attention. So I think that they'll walk away with, like, oh my God, some concrete things to do.
Oh, that's awesome. I'm so excited, and I will definitely be there. So it's on April 26th, correct?
Right, April 26th.
Yeah.
Yes.
And there's a couple different times to choose from. So you can find that link down below. And then will there be a replay if people can't make it live?
I will.
Okay.
I'll do a replay. Yeah, for sure.
Awesome.
I really want people to have this information.
I
I'm
know.
annoyed with things going on in the spiritual community. And like I said a minute ago, I really think that there are more people ready and willing to do this. They just want some kind of guidance, and I think that they'll do it. And so I hope that that's something I can offer, I really do.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much for doing that. And thank you for being here and talking to our audience here on YouTube.
I'm really, I really love talking to you and your audience. Thank you so much for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. And if you want to learn more about Chriselda's work, definitely check out her webinar. You can also find her at ChriseldaPacheco.com. Her Instagram is also Chriselda Pacheco. I'm going to post all that down below. And yeah, we'll see you guys next time. Bye, everyone.